I wish you all a very warm welcome to the second webinar series, or second webinar of our webinar series that WageIndicator Foundation is organizing together with the Democratizing Work Network. I am pleased to see many of also those that are connected to the Democratizing Work Network, and we're super happy that you all could make it. My name is Fiona Drachta. I'm your moderator of today of this session, and we have two special guests here today, both with the J, Janna Besamusca and Jenny Nedelski. We're super happy to have you here and listen from your perspective on this important topic that is also in a lot of policy debates around the world currently. Maybe to kick us off and to set some rules of engagement of this webinar today. The idea of our webinar series is really that we have engagement with all of you, that we listen to your perspectives on the topic that we set out on the day as well. So once again, if your internet connection allows it, it would be great to have your video there as well so we can see your faces. Feel free absolutely to share your reflections or questions in the chat also while Janna and Jenny are setting the scene already. And we'll be asking some of your engagement also during the webinar itself. We hope that this space is a space for reflection and getting new ideas, and that you walk away today with some maybe extra information and new perspectives on the topic that we will discuss today. So feel free to engage and come up with new and fresh ideas as well. I'm really happy to announce today that we have two wonderful speakers that will work with us, or that will set the scene with us together about the topic around working less or living more, with a question mark. We thought about this webinar idea, especially around, because we know that in, the recent years, there's been a lot of talk about how we can reduce work time more, as such that people can live their lives a bit better and have a better work-life balance. But there's a lot of research being done also about how, for especially often women in the labor market, this then reflects on more care duties, even if they work less. So that's why we have a question mark after the working less, living more, because we don't necessarily know if work time reduction also always means that means that you work less, right? We are also asking ourselves some questions about our working less even feasible options for people in maybe less developed countries where having a stable job is not even a given. We hope that we are able to engage you with some of these probing questions today, and please share all of the reflections that you have on the topic as well yourself. With that being said, I'm really happy to announce our two panelists of today. The first one is Janna Besamusca. She's an assistant professor of Interdisciplinary Social Science at Utrecht University. She did her PhD at the University of Amsterdam, where she did research on the position of mothers in the labor market in middle and high income countries. And as a labor sociologist, she conducted research into decent work also in low wage sectors, wages in collective bargaining, and on self-employment and motherhoods, and the effect of work-family policies on mothers in the labor market. Next to that, Janna is also a member of the Supervisory Board of WageIndicator, and she works a lot with WageIndicator databases on wages, as well as on collective agreements. So welcome, Janna. And the other speaker of today is Jenny Nedelski, who's a professor at the Osgood Law School in York University in Canada. And her teaching and scholarship have been concentrated often on feminist theory, as well as legal theory, the American constitutional history and interpretation thereof, and comparative constitutionalism. And Jenny and other colleagues have recently wrote a book about laws, relations, and the relational theory of self-autonomy and law, and the Care Manifesto that she wrote together with Tom Malliston, which is the Care Manifesto Part-Time for All, which is coming in soon. So Jenny is also sharing some reflections on the book as well, and hence some reflections on the role of care within this question of today. But to kick us off, I first want to get a bit of a sense of the room, and therefore we have two polls to get your understanding of where you are when it comes to your own working hours. Guys, my lovely assistance team, can you set up one of the polls?
Yeah, Niels, are you launching it?
So question number 1 is related to the actual working hours that are based on your contract, if you even have a contract, of course, that even mentions hours. It might be that your contract doesn't even mention hours. I see that most of us have in between 20 to 40 hours listed on their contract, which I think in many countries and within many CBAs is actually a quite standard working hour within the week, right? And we actually also have a second poll, which is a different, which is maybe a bit more about the topic that we discussed today. Niels, can you launch poll number 2? And this is about how many hours you actually work in a week. Oh, interesting. We have somebody who works fewer hours. That's good. Good for you. Really good. So I think this poll already makes clear that often, very often, many people actually work more than they are contractually obliged to do so.
We can share the results. Sorry to interrupt,
Yeah,
but we can share the results also with the.
Yeah.
So for the results, so this is the results of the second poll. The first one, we had most people between 20 to 40 hours. And we had quite a few above 40 and very few under 20. And yeah. Sorry for the interruption.
No worries at all. So I think it shows already that that in general, very often, I mean, we are a very small sample size, of course, but many people have contractually more or less standard working hours in their contracts, but often for a wide variety of reasons, many people work more often hours than they are obliged to do so. That being said, I would love to give the floor to Janna to set the scene from her perspective and her research on this important topic. Janna, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a few slides, only I think 4 or so, when we talk about basically introducing the topic a little bit. So what I'm going to be doing is seeing if we can get some kind of like common vocabulary. I know that we're a mix of people who are practitioners, people who are academics, and maybe if we're academics, we're from very different fields focused on things like industrial relations compared to labor economics and very different ways at looking at it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some of my thoughts on how we could be thinking about reducing working time, starting with just the fact of like, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be reducing your work time? And that really starts already with what you just said before, that we all have something in our contract. Well, not all of us, but many of you did say you have employment contracts that contain a specific number of working hours per week. And so unless you've negotiated for shorter working hours or longer working hours, the hours in your contract probably reflect the standard working hours in your organization. And a reduction of those kind of working hours has traditionally been on the agenda of the trade union movement. Right? And these kind of things, traditional demands, like actually for a 40-hour work week, were around in much of Europe around the Second World War. And they were successful, and actually so successful that now when I teach and I look at my students, we're around 20 or so who are in my lecture halls, most of them don't even know that we ever had a 6-day work week or that we ever had a 50-hour work week. Right? And so those kind of things now by young students in the Netherlands are often considered as something that maybe happens in other parts of the world, but not in our country. And so I think we've seen that these kind of reductions can really be implemented, can be successful, and can change. And in recent years, I think there's mainly been a lot of discussion on the 4-day work week. And a 4-day work week here specifically really means a work week of about 30 to 32 hours that you work in about 4 days. So this is not about condensed work weeks where you still work 40 hours, but you just cram everything into 4 days. This is an actual reduction in those work hours. And there's been a lot of work on that, for example, by Hyung Chung, but also by Koot and Pang. And there's been some recent trials in this in the UK, for example, by the Work Time Reduction Center for Excellence. And they did some trials showing that there were benefits for both employees and employers. So these companies, they implemented the 4-day work week as a kind of like, let's just try and see what happens. And we see that employees actually reported less stress, lower burnout, and less fatigue than before, as well as a better work-life balance, life satisfaction, mental and physical health, as well as actually doing more exercise. And employers in a trial by the 4-day Global Week Initiative, they reported that their turnover and burnout decreased, so they were able to actually hang on to much more employees, while actually revenue went up, workability went up, and they found it easier to attract new personnel. So that all sounds like a pretty nice thing going on. Nevertheless, when we look at statements by, for example, Industrial, the global trade union, they put some question marks next to these kind of results and saying, well, actually, is this something we can implement across the world, or is this just something we do in professional jobs? And they point out that workers who already have a lot of trouble making ends meet are not going to go work less, right? Because they need that money. And nor can a 4-day work week be easily implemented in environments where employees work in shifts, for example. And so that also makes us wonder, I think, when we look at collective work time reductions, are we maybe watching privilege at work here? So are we seeing that those workers who are already better paid and who already have more of a say over when they work and where they work, are these the workers that now also get the opportunity to actually work less hours? And so much of the work time reduction that we see around is actually not the previous part of collective reductions, but a large part of that is also individual reductions of working time, right? And so people work less than is the norm in their organization. And that can be for a number of reasons that we're going to go into a little bit now, like work-life balance, health reasons, preferences, or sometimes you just cannot get full-time hours at your employer even. And when you think about it that way, you see that also there's some element missing in this trade union campaign, which is, let me say, from the 40s and 50s, right? And you see there's some things here that are missing that are actually very present in the lives of many people today and back then. I don't know if you can see what it is, but you might have guessed children, right? So most of us don't sit around reading newspapers in a boat on our free time, right? We take care of kids, we take care of our parents, we clean the house, we cook, we do groceries, and all next to that, we still have sports we want to do. We have the hobbies we want to do. We have friends we want to see. And so we might want to reduce those hours for more of a personal reason. And then from a more sociological and psychological perspective, what clashes with those reductions really is something that in sociology we refer to as the idealization of long hours. And so the way that many workplaces today are organized is that working long hours are often appreciated. And they're seen as a sign of devotion to your job and to your career. And so it's something you need to do to move ahead. And in that context, it's not necessarily self-evident that people are going to work less, even if you wanted to. And so, for example, in 2000, when France introduced a 35-hour work week across the country, there were actually very relatively minor changes in actual work hours. And many people just work more overtime. And you show that also in your answer to the poll a few minutes ago, when over half of you, I'm just checking the stats now, over half of you are actually doing more work than is in your contract. And so in both psychology and sociology, these kind of work cultures where you think you should be working more are labeled as having what we call ideal worker norms. And an ideal worker then is somebody who is always available for work and who prioritizes work over other things. And so that working all the time is a sign of devotion to work, which makes us think that to be a good academic or a good trade unionist or a good manager or a good lawyer, you have to feel this kind of passion for your job, right? And who wouldn't want to spend more time on their passion rather than less? Which brings us to the fact that if you have this passion and devotion to your job, you actually might end up working more hours rather than less. Even if you were given the opportunity to work less. And that is something that is shown also by sociologists like Mary Blair-Loy and Heyoung Chung, show that these kind of cultures really reward people who spend more time on work. And that can even lead to something that we call self-exploitation, where the more freedom you get from your boss, the more autonomy you get from your job, from your boss, actually the harder and the longer you end up working. And we also see that these kind of cultures really penalize those that spend less time on work. For example, if you work part-time, because you also have to take care of your kids. And part-time work has been associated with lower pay, less career progress, and in many countries also more precarious working conditions. And so these kind of individual working time reductions, as opposed to the collective reductions, you really do at your own risk at the moment in our current societies. And so perhaps the last thing I want to look at that might be a first and important step to take is, might we not try and create the kind of workplace cultures where instead of reducing the formal hours, we're going to actually work during work time, right? And that is something that is currently also being debated, especially among younger generations, and that is now being called quiet quitting. And quiet quitting is referred to as basically doing the bare minimum. It means you do the job tasks you're paid to do, and you work during the hours you're paid to work. And so I think it's really interesting that this is framed as quiet quitting and as the bare minimum, considering that you're doing exactly what you're paid to do. And so it's perhaps a signal of our time that is understood as doing the bare minimum. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Janna. Great, and love your all of the images that you use. Brilliant. Jenny, would you like to set the scene and perhaps also reflect a little bit on what Janna just shared?
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so glad to have heard Janna's presentation. You'll hear as I give a summary of the book argument how important this issue of idealized work, and I talk also about it's not just your career, but excellence and success are so tied to long hours for us and status. So let me just say that the book is actually out. And I have an interesting thought here looking at the audience, which is very nice to be able to see. So I've been doing a lot of these, and this is the first that is work focused as opposed to care, reproductive labor focused. And I notice a big gender difference. So most of the audience in the care, reproductive labor, sorry, switch to a different language? No. Sorry, I just get some kind of sign here. Anyway, the audience in the care world is female. And so, part of what this book tries to do is bring together the issues of work and lowering work hours with the issues of care. Because actually, we have two separate literatures out there and research agendas, one in care, which doesn't talk to the work people, and one in the work that isn't focused on care. And it's a challenge for me, because what I would really like to do to see next is our pilot projects. But it's one thing to get an employer to be willing to run a pilot project on reduced hours. Lots of employers are doing that. But then actually also asking their employees to share care in the way in which I'm going to suggest. That's a much bigger challenge, actually. Okay, so let me just go to my summary, and then I'll come back as I go to some of the points that Janna has made. So I'd like to begin with something from the preface to the book. One of the most important insights I got from having my children was the importance of routine physical caretaking for forming the basic bonds of human connection. That initial insight broadened into a belief that physical caretaking is part of what roots us in the world and permits us to feel a connection with the material foundations of life, from the care the earth requires to respect for the labor that permits us to live as we do. The dominant culture of North America treats virtually all forms of physical caretaking with contempt. Until there is a shift in this basic stance, those who do the caretaking will be treated with contempt. They will be paid little and defined as unsuccessful. If caretaking were actually valued, there would be a revolution in the structure of our society. So I wrote those sentences in 1998. Now, with Tom Mallison, I offer a path to that transformation. Our book is about new norms that could restructure our lives so that everyone, no matter how important their work, experiences the joy and connection of caregiving, both physical and emotional. The norm would be that all who are able provide roughly 20 to 25 hours of unpaid care every week, an amount sufficient for them to acquire the knowledge and connection that care brings. The need to learn from care grounds our argument that everyone needs to do it. In addition, roughly 30 hours a week would be the upper end of the norm for paid work. We think these profound changes could have vitally important impacts, ending the unsustainable stress on families and the gross inequality for those who provide care. It could also ensure that high-level decision makers actually know something about care, and those who do know something about care could become policymakers. Even if caregivers were respected and well compensated, as long as one group of people makes the policy in corporations and government, and a different group does the care, we will continue to have dangerously ignorant policymakers. Part-time for all, the framework that we propose, could end the long-standing degradation of care and those who do it, as well as the policy distortions that flow from failing to recognize the value of care. As we were completing the book, the global pandemic struck. COVID-19 has made it brutally obvious that people cannot get their work done unless someone is available to provide care. So I think there's no better time than now to pose the fundamental question: what happens to care when the demands of the workplace are structured such that they ignore the need for care? Getting people back to work as we knew it will not address this vital question. Work relies on care, but care is becoming unsustainable because of the structure of work and the ongoing failure to value care. Who is supposed to provide care for it when the ideal worker, as Janna has told us, is still somebody whose top priority is work? Better publicly funded care for children, the elderly, and people with disabilities is urgently needed, but none of that will solve the underlying problems of a workplace demands that are incompatible with care, and a pervasive degradation of care and those who do it. It will not solve the problem of policymakers ignorant about care. This book presents the argument that the problems of care, its low status and its unequal distribution, cannot be fixed without changing the structure of work. By reducing work hours across the board, with no exceptions for important jobs at the top, individuals, families, and societies will reap the benefits of a revaluation of care and a population who has learned the joys, the skills, and the dispositions of care by doing it. Now, I just want to note that I think the discussion of these issues of who does the work and who does the care and how that's distributed, what the demands of the workplace are, that's a conversation that should be happening everywhere in the world. But the particular solution that we're proposing is something which has well-off countries in mind. And of course, we recognize that reducing work hours is not what the problem is for many people. It's actually getting enough work, or their large numbers of hours are from multiple precarious jobs added up together, not a single contract. So now let me just turn to a summary of the book. There are many issues confronting contemporary societies. Our book is focused on 4 specific but interlocking problems. The first is that of stressed families. In other words, the unsustainable structure of work and family life that puts enormous stress on families and forces many people, particularly women, into untenable choices between work and family. Bridget Schulte, an American journalist, has poignantly described the widespread feeling of being constantly overwhelmed, of always doing more than one thing at a time, of always being behind and always late. And that's an example, too, of how working from home is not a solution to these deep underlying problems. A second major problem is that of inequality. The provision of care is organized around hierarchical lines. The most obvious category around which care is organized, of course, is gender. But today it's obvious that gender intersects with other categories, such as race, class, and citizenship status. The reality is that those on top, rich white men, do very little care. The key point is that as long as care work remains stigmatized, as long as powerful men do very little of it, and poor women do the bulk of it, society will continue to be profoundly unequal in terms of status and economic well-being. I often say in my talks and to my students that even if you don't care about feminism, gender equality, families, even if your object is equality, you can't get equality as long as care is organized around hierarchy and degradation. A third problem we refer to is what we call the care policy divide. Those in top policy-making positions in government or business are almost always people with very little experience of the demands, satisfactions, and importance of caregiving. This means that policymakers are, for the most part, ignorant of a core dimension of human life. This renders them unfit for the job. We should no more consider electing someone without substantial experience in caregiving to public office or appointing them CEO of a corporation than we would someone who had never held a job. Our claim is that knowledge of care is essential to good policymaking, and the necessary knowledge can only be acquired by a substantial amount of ongoing, hands-on caregiving. Reading novels, talking to your mother, reading reports is not a substitute. The final problem, which intersects with all the above, is that of time scarcity. Across the OECD, 17% of men work over 50 hours per week. In Europe, the average woman in a couple with children works a massive 71 hours every week when you include her unpaid care work. The roots of these four problems are clearly complex, but there are two fundamental causes. The first is the dominant norms of who's expected to do care and who gets a pass from this core human responsibility. The second is the economic system, which particularly in the neoliberal countries generates widespread economic insecurity. The only real path to economic security in those countries is becoming an ideal worker. Someone willing to work full-time and who can displace family and care obligations to the margins of their life or onto the shoulders of others, paid or unpaid. Our book is aimed at the kind of fundamental change that could actually address these deep systemic problems at their roots. Our proposal is part-time for all. In essence, our proposal is that we need a dramatic change in the dominant norms of who does care work. And second, we need a complementary set of changes to our workplaces in order to foster and facilitate a more equitable distribution of care. So let me say a few words about both sides of the proposal. We think that the heart of the solution must be new norms that everyone is responsible for providing care. Our proposal is that all capable adults should be expected to perform significant amounts of care throughout their lives. No matter who you are, how important your work is, even if you're a preeminent surgeon, all-star athlete, or senior executive, everyone should be doing substantial care. And likewise, everyone should work part-time, that is, no more than 30 hours a week. And I should say that we do make space in the book for periods of intensity. There are lots of jobs, including lawyers or international aid workers, who there are going to be chunks of time, up to months, when they can't be fulfilling their care obligations. So the solution to that is you go off, you do your work for an earthquake survivors, or you finish your big case, and then you come back and you don't work. You make up that time in care. Our argument is that practically everyone is capable of learning how to provide decent quality care, just like almost everyone is capable of becoming a competent parent. And moreover, everyone needs to experience substantial amount of care work in order to reap the benefits that come from it. So the project is to radically change the norms of who does care. People would encourage one another to resist the pressures of taking on more work and support and appreciate one another's care. Now, while we advocate support rather than shame, there will be a certain kind of shaming that always comes with norms. So, for example, announcing your failure to meet those norms, say continuing to proudly announce how long you work or that you don't do care because you have such an important talent, would generate the sort of concern, disapproval, embarrassment, pity, or unease that currently would arise if a competent adult male announced at a party that he had never held a job. So workaholism, which is a phrase that at least in North America has come to be something one can announce with pride, would actually be treated for what it is, an illness. As with current gender norms, people would feel some pressure to conform, but it is important to remember that in our model, these are norms, not laws, though there would be some laws necessary to facilitate this transformation. There'd be no bureaucracy to define and measure care. No one would go to jail for working more than 30 hours or be fined for failing to change their fair share of diapers. On this model, the responsibility for care is lifelong. It does not follow the current arc of life stages, intense when children are young or parents are elderly. When these immediate demands recede, we expect that people would maintain their care obligations in chosen communities of care. Those could be faith communities, neighborhoods, geographic neighborhoods, soccer clubs, a group of people, not family primarily, not intimate friends, with whom one forms fairly long-term bonds of commitment of mutual care. And we also see that care for the earth is an important part of this project for similar reasons. It's essential. Care for the earth is essential for life on the planet, and we also think that one has to do care for the earth in order to actually get the care from the earth as a gift, which then generates reciprocal obligations for care in return. We think that there's a deep shift in values necessary to address the climate change, and revaluing care is going to be part of that. For part-time for all to be feasible, the central economic requirement is that everyone has access to good part-time jobs. By this, we mean jobs that are secure, flexible, and high quality. High quality, meaning that they provide pay and benefits and opportunities for advancement that are proportional to what is now traditional full-time work in good jobs. In particular, for part-time work to be at all attractive to people and not scary, it needs to be reinforced by economic security. A core ingredient of our proposal is a living wage, defined as what one person and a child can live on comfortably at 30 hours a week. And increasingly, although we only address this in passing in the book, it's clear that some solution to the worldwide housing crisis is going to have to happen if people can actually live on 30 hours a week. But that is, how to do that is beyond the scope of our book. None of these things currently exist in much of the Anglo world. Nevertheless, the kinds of economic structures that it requires are not at all utopian. Many of the elements already exist in various countries, particularly, as many of you know, in Western Northern Europe. For instance, in the Netherlands, a massive 47% of the labor force is engaged in part-time work. It's the world's first part-time economy, although it remains fairly gendered in how that work is taken up. Similarly, a number of countries show that it is completely feasible to provide robust economic security. For instance, in Denmark, a single mother working 30 hours per week on minimum wage could earn around 22,000 euros, whereas a living wage is only around 14,000 euros, whereas in New York City, it would be impossible for somebody to come anywhere near able to live on 30 hours a week at minimum wage at the moment. In sum, we argue that a society of part-time for all could be viably built on four main pillars: quality part-time work, flexibility, or what we prefer to call time sovereignty, economic security, and care-friendly policies. Such a society does not currently exist anywhere in the world, yet we demonstrate that each and every one of these components do. We know that each pillar is feasible, as it already exists in some form, and we see no reason why the pillars could not be combined. This is the essential realism of what sometimes looks like a utopian project. We're not advocating institutions that are unknown or untried. We can overcome the standard but very real political difficulties of electing care-friendly governments into office. Part-time is then an entirely practical project. It is institutionally sound, economically affordable, ecologically sustainable, and capable of withstanding the pressures of globalization. And I want to close with some remarks that I developed when I was giving this talk to a group of women lawyers, and it really resonates with many of the issues that Janna raised. So law, I teach in a law school. Law is an example of many of the high status professions in North America that have generated an intense mythology around long hours with pride. Long hours as part of the importance, status, success, excellence. And while there are now actually in the US some books out about how there's no reason in the world why you can't organize a law firm around reasonable hours, you will, I've heard it myself, many lawyers will simply tell you it's impossible. It's not in the nature of the profession. And medicine, especially around the issue of how medical students are trained in North America, they have another story about how these long hours are absolutely essential, nothing you could possibly do about them. So I think what we have to see is, as Janna's points were pointing to, we need to not just redefine the hours of work, but of excellence, our models of status and excellence, so that we can break this nexus that is so powerful, at least in North America, between long hours, success, and excellence. So as you've already heard, part of our point is that absolutely everyone needs to do care in order to learn from care. And one of the things that people learn is taking the perspectives of others. You can't care well for someone if you can't take their perspective. And this capacity for perspective taking is essential for good judgment, which is, of course, very important in almost everything. And it's increasingly, this capacity to take the perspectives of others is increasingly important in our diverse and divided societies. So I see this, the kinds of things we learn from care are really important and valuable outside the specific field of care. The distinction between work and care is ultimately arbitrary, but it's necessary in order to articulate this argument for changing. But of course, care involves work, and good work involves care. And it's the second point that I'm hoping there'll be more and more recognition of as norms like this develop. For almost everyone, it's important to think about care for co-workers, including mentoring, for clients, and for oneself. So return to this issue of status. I think the high status of many professions exacerbates a more general issue, which I've been thinking more and more about. Part of the way we're all trained to think that work is more important than care. And I noticed this in myself even after spending years and years writing this book. It's always hard to value care obligations at the same level as valuing work. Part of how we're trained to think that way in our culture is that the scope and scale of impact, how many people are we reaching? What kind of impact are we making in the world? Is in an inverse relationship with intimate relations and direct care. Direct care is always slow, at small scale, local impact. At present, Western societies code success as being as high up on a hierarchy of power and impact as possible. And this almost always means doing little direct care. I think that part of the reason some people are resistant to the proposal of part-time law to limit paid work to a maximum of 30 hours a week and not to let even activism interfere with the core commitment of 22 hours a week of direct care is this sense of, but care is low impact. Why would you take away the time you have to make a big impact through your work or through your activism for some mundane care work? I think it looks like too much important high impact work or its excellence would be sacrificed to the low-impact, small-scale care. But in fact, I think most humans thrive best and learn what they need to know to support good values in their communities if they are regularly involved in both direct care and in activities at larger scales, where they feel their contribution on a wider scale. Under our current structures of work and degradation of care, people are forced into a choice. Part-time for all would go a long way to address that. But it would also put us on a path to deeper change, one necessary to address climate change and more generally for good governance. I believe we need an overarching change in stance towards life that connects the issues of scale, care, and relationship with the tasks of collective cooperation. Good collective decision-making is not likely to be fostered by a norm of tension and stress for those delegated to do this work, either in the daily form of carrying out policies or adjudicating disputes or deciding on the laws, policies, or norms that are to organize collective life. The dominant picture of the busy, important person, whether academic, lawyer, CEO, must give way to forms of human interaction that are slow enough, reflective enough, relationally connected enough to foster not only clear, creative thinking, but a stance of care and compassion towards one's co-workers and towards those who will be affected by our decisions. Part-time for all, what can be advocated for right now, will lead us in that direction. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jenny, for that perfect pledge. Part-time for all, that's what it is. Thanks a lot. I want to do a very quick poll to set us off for the further discussion, but I'm hoping both Janna's talk and Jenny's talk has given you some food for thought, and we will soon open the floor for some discussions. But I'm very curious to also hear from all of you what you would do if you have less working hours in a week, what you would actually do. Guys, can you launch the last poll? So if you would have a full day of less obligated work time, what would you do?
You have to pick one.
Yes, you can pick one.
You can only pick one, I think.
Yeah, so what would be your top priority, I suppose, out of all of these?
Perhaps if your top priority is not in the list, you can just add it in the chat.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
That as well. I, for one, don't know what to pick.
I was trying to click them all.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, ideally, I would love to do them all. I know that from my side, I have no idea what I would do. Writing more.
Writing
nice.
more.
Nice. Great. Thanks a lot, everybody. I think it shows that many are looking into different possibilities. But we do see actually a lot who say that they would leisure more. That's nice. Mm-hmm. Is there somebody who would like to reflect on their answer given in the poll? Please feel free to either raise your hand or just open your mic.
I think maybe, Fiona, that also is a little bit connected to what we understand as living more, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is also the big question about Jenny's thesis, that part-time for all and care for all. Is that care for all then part of living more? Or is, are the other hours a week that you're neither doing paid work nor doing care work, are those you're living more?
Yeah.
And so I think that really would depend on us as people as well, right? Do you see that care as something leisurely, something you like to do and that inspires you, or is it something that you feel like you have to do?
Is there somebody who would like to reflect on both what Janna just shared as well as the two talks just now? Is there something that pops in your mind that you're like, I haven't thought about this yet? Or in this way? I mean, Jenny is actually basically proposing to us that we have to restructure the way that we function as society, right? I mean, does anybody of you agree with this? Or do you feel like from your perspective, this wouldn't work at all?
So I have a question. I'm not sure we're doing questions now, but
Go ahead.
I mean,
Go ahead.
Okay, I mean, so since we are talking about sort of the larger social effects of this, I've been reading, I mean, separately on issues of aging and, you know, like the larger demographic consequences. And there were two things that I came across while reading about that, which sort of coincided. One is, I mean, obviously, so there are, in a lot of places, it's being, you know, claimed that, you know, women are actively shying away from marriage or having children because obviously they're disproportionately burdened with care work, and therefore it's a, you know, direct penalty, I think, on their careers, you know, having children. I think there's been research from different places, including Denmark, that's shown that the gender pay gap is less a gender pay gap than a penalty for motherhood in that way. And so, and also, I mean, I read that I think in Europe, there's been this growing trend of women having children over the age of 40, because basically, again, delaying motherhood to avoid the early penalties to their careers, and especially using things like assisted reproductive technology, which also has negative health effects for them. I mean, I'm just looking at sort of the larger consequences at a, you know, again, I mean, social, demographic, economic, political level that this is having, because once you look at low workforces, questions of opening immigration also come up. I mean, is there a recognition that, again, something like care imbalance in care and care responsibilities and work time are having these very, I mean, almost not, I mean, not catastrophic, but very, very serious consequences in society at large?
So can I say a word to
Go
that?
ahead. Yeah, sure.
So I'm happy to say that my book is already being translated into Korean. And I gave a talk in Korea and learned there that they have the lowest birth rate in the world. And they have some of the longest working hours. And, you know, to me, it's almost, now that contraception is available, it's possible for women to just say, we're not doing this. You know, we're not going to work these long hours and try to have families because there's been no adjustment to the care responsibilities, or a tiny one. So young people are not forming families, and they're not having children. So this is a different for the United States by class. Some of you will have read this data that, so in the US, the poor are not getting married, but they are having kids. And this has its own problems of poverty in particular. But so yes, we can see in cases like Korea, which just sort of manifested so starkly, that if you can't fix this problem of putting all your energy into more and more work hours, including a co-optation of feminists to say, well, that's the path to equality, right? We know that part-time work has not done the job for women for equality. So let's get everybody in the full-time workforce without trying to figure out who's going to do the care. And this just it's just not sustainable. So
Thanks a lot, Jenny.
You're looking at the chat, right? I'm not trying to read these.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm just going to take on some of the questions from bottom to below. So Jean, you were posing the question about if there is a possible conflict between those who want to work more and earn more and those who want to work less and earn less. Could you maybe, if you want to, you can ask the question yourself, or maybe elaborate on your question a bit more?
Well, what I have in mind is that those who want to work more and earn more will set standards of living that the others may not be able to emulate, and then that could create a tension. So I'm curious to know, in your proposal, is it that everyone will just choose freely how many hours they work, or will you set some norms, and will there be legal constraints on how much you can work and so on? If you can just spell that out, it would be useful, because I'm not familiar with your book. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. So first, just a word on income. we picture that the only people whose income is going to significantly go down are the rich, that maybe the top 10 to 20%. At the bottom, we expect greater economic redistribution so that the poverty would be alleviated. And in the middle, Tom, my co-author, who was really responsible for this part of the argument, is modeling it on the French model, that you, over a period of, say, 10 years, most workers will trade wages for hours, income, adjusted for inflation. So they get to keep their income and reduce their hours rather than gradually raise their income. So that, just to get a picture for the demographics, we are expecting the wealthy to work fewer hours and have less income. But so the ways in which we expect this to actually play out in terms of the ways in which norms constrain people's behavior. And some people say, well, why do you just keep talking about norms? Why not laws? And my first answer is, we should remember that millions of hours of unpaid labor are extracted from women all over the world just from norms. Norms are tremendously powerful, and we shouldn't underestimate them. And so changing the norms, if it becomes embarrassing to say that you work more than 30 hours a week, if people, maybe recommend a good therapist or something, instead of a badge of honor, then we expect people's behaviors will change by all the ways in which social norms are constraints in our lives now. Of course, I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience that you'd be crazy to think that, who does care work is a matter of individual preference, unshaped by societal norms. I mean, that's hard to believe. Anyway, so we are not leaving it to individual preference. The norms are nobody does more than 30 hours a week of paid work, and everybody who's able, about 22 hours of unpaid care. But we expect, though, just to respond in part to that question, that as work stops being the definer of identity and status, so you might meet somebody at a party, instead of saying, what do you do, meaning what's your paid work, you say, oh, what kind of care are you engaged in? Or, what form of community activism do you do? That our identity definers would become different. We expect then that as work and income are reduced in their significance as our identities, so would the consumption. So that the competition around consumption, we would expect to be significantly reduced. I'm not saying eliminated, because we do want to say that this is compatible with a capitalist economy. Regardless about whether it would be better if it weren't, it's important to say it is compatible. We can do it now. We do not have to wait for the revolution.
I mean, or it is the revolution.
Or it is the revolution. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Jenny.
Yes.
I'm just quickly checking with Joshua. Do you want to respond to Jenny's point here? And then I'm going to give the floor to Brian, who's been asking some very good questions in the chat as well.
No, I think going to Brian. Well, I mean, I was a question about norms, but I think I'd rather just go in the queue. So so go ahead, and Brian.
Okay, Brian, yeah. I think maybe your questions in the chat as well about how do we decouple money and power to this question as well, right? Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that in relating to what Jenny just shared?
Do you mean me?
Yes. Sorry, do I say your name wrong?
Sorry, it's Bryn. It's Bryn.
Oh, Bryn. Sorry.
It's all right.
Bryn, go ahead.
I was just wondering if there was a secret Brian in the chat. What about decoupling money and power? It was, first of all, one thing actually, thank you so much for these presentations. One thing it really makes me think of that we speak a lot where I work is actually sometimes you have to get one thing out of the way to make a lot of other stuff possible. So in city planning, for example, it's cars. We have to get rid of cars if they're moving or if they're parked, and then suddenly everything everyone wants becomes possible, better waste management to more trees, and maybe work, or at least employment, is something we have to slightly get out the way in the way we organize our weeks. And so I thought that was really, really interesting there. But yeah, the question about money and power then was about how do we, I really love the utopian idea that we would just change norms, but I'd love a bit more the idea about how we make that change in norms happen when ultimately, at least if we do this within a capitalist context, money is power, and people who work more will have more money, especially if they're highly skilled. I struggle to see how we stop ourselves falling back into this slightly kind of winner takes all logic with bigger and bigger gaps in wealth and the power that goes with it. I don't know if you've thought about that, especially Jenny, kind of safeguards you can put in place to stop that happening, or if we're just really hoping that norms will do the work. Because I agree, norms can be really, really, really powerful, but these norms would be going against the structural flow of power in our society. So I'm really intrigued about that.
Yes, so that's of course a big challenge, and we do say specifically, you know, there is no modern democracy that have solved this problem, right? There are different levels of economic inequality, and they always follow different levels of political power and social power. So we acknowledge that, and I would say that we have, like I said briefly before, we expect a shift at both ends of the distribution, right? Raising everybody at the bottom up, and a essentially voluntary reduction at the top. So I just say another word about norms. So we, in part, in response to questions like this over the years, I have 5, I think, short examples of things that, big changes that I think began as norm changes. So the first is, you know, the incomplete feminist revolution, which really was a grassroots movement. Most recently, the astonishing rapidity with which the change around same-sex relations has happened all over the world. That really began at the grassroots. And I must say, you know, in Canada, because the Supreme Court entered in early on, mandating same-sex marriage, people tended to put a lot of weight on that. But I think if we now look at the trajectory in the United States, which was only a year or two behind without that court intervention in most places, I think it's wrong to put the weight on the courts. This was essentially a norm change at grassroots level with huge impact and very closely tied to identity issues, which is the case here with gender and work. And drinking and driving, so that's an interesting example because it was always illegal. There were no norms against it. So everybody could leave in North America. So I remember early on, back in the 60s, going to Sweden and discovering that people actually, you know, when you arrived at a big party, people asked who was the designated driver. In North America, never heard of such a thing. But so that's a big difference. The laws were static, but then they actually got enforced because the norms changed. And anyway, so there are a lot of examples of really non-trivial social transformations that have started as norm change. Now, I do think that the question, I think this has to, just like we say that economic security, without economic security, this would only be the option of the well-to-do, right? And I do think that this goes back to Janna's point about individual transformations, right? Individual accommodations. When I started giving these talks where there were a lot of government lawyers in the room, people would come up to me privately and say they had privately negotiated a deal to do part-time work. It was not part of and it never became, even though it worked perfectly for them and their bosses were very happy with it, it never became policy. So it's possible to start at the individual level, but then we all have to, you know, do the work of trying to make that systemic. And I will say, you know, I left my job of 33 years at the University of Toronto Law School because they said no. They would not commit to letting me move to part-time. And fortunately for me, there was another law school in the city. And they said yes, they created a part-time job for me. But I will say this was not without complications. Because even universities are not set up to have full-time senior faculty as part-time workers. It's just, those are incompatible categories. It turned out I couldn't be on any important committees because they were designated as you had to be tenured and full-time. And I had agreed to accept, you know, a part-time contract anyway. So I think the underlying question of power and money is behind any transformation, right, including climate change, and it has to be gotten at in tandem with the other things. But I think that these norm changes could actually erode the money status link that is so powerful in contemporary capitalism.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. I'm also looking at Janna to see if you would want to reflect on this point about decoupling money and power, because you came up with a point about the status, right? So do you want to share some of your reflections on this point?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a very interesting debate going on between, like, how do we, to me, the most interesting part is how are we actually getting to this utopia, right? In a sense of, is that a possibility? And I do think that the current link between money and power is not as obvious as Bryn said in the introduction, in the sense that I think there's a lot of work, especially at the top, showing that people who work at the top don't actually necessarily work much harder than everybody else, right? But there's certainly a large, like, in between. And I think it's also very much our understanding that a manager works harder than somebody who's working in the parks and recreation, right? Who's cleaning everything, or who's working in the gardens, who's actually on their knees the entire time, standing up, lifting things, walking around, but is sometimes understood to be working less hard than somebody who's sitting around in an office. And I think that is something, well, there's good reason to say, if you look at occupations like lawyers and doctors, etc., that they make long hours and they make much money. But there's also exceptions, especially at that top 1% and top 10%, where you see a lot of people actually that money that they're making is not necessarily from their own work, but from appropriating the work of others, right? And that doing the same work in much heavier occupations actually might be much harder work. In a sense also that I think much of this research looks at standard hours, right? So remember the question that we looked at, what hours are in your contract? Now we see that in many occupations, for example, like in construction or many low-paid occupations, there's a large difference between the hours in your contract and the hours they're actually doing. Because people make up those hours with overtime, right? They make up those hours with night shifts. They make up those hours in all kinds of ways. But they're not being paid that by a standard degree. And I think part of that also comes down to something that we should be considering in this debate, and that is employer discretion, right? The ability to determine when and where your workers actually work is crucial to employers, especially in an economy like ours, where we want to be able to order something online today and then get it by the end of the week or even tomorrow, right? That means that as an employer, it becomes very important to set up your production process to fluctuating markets, to be able to say that we need a night shift. We need somebody to work on Saturday, because also, I mean, all of us do our grocery shopping on Saturday too, right? I mean, is anybody who never does grocery shopping on Saturday or in the evening? Oh, Fiona. No. So I think that kind of like, and I think that is something that we need to then also visualize, like, what would that economy look like, right? Or do we entirely let go of the idea that there's a Monday to Friday and there's a weekend? So do we let go of that idea of there's shared days off in that sense? And I think the last thing I want to reflect on is to what extent you're actually arguing for part-time work, Jenny, because I think at the moment, or at the point that you say part-time for all, part-time is a new full-time, right? 30, is it any different at that point from the 4-day working week? The idea that we just all work less.
Sorry, say that last point again, please.
So if we all work part-time, then that part-time is no longer part-time, right? That part-time is a new full-time. And so to that extent, nobody's working part-time anymore. Everybody's working full-time, except full-time is now a very different number of hours.
Yes, that's right. Can I just say one thing back to that?
Of course, go ahead.
I was at this convention of women lawyers, and that I went to the panel before mine, which had 4 women of color or indigenous backgrounds talking about, what does it mean to be a leader? I'm sorry to say that the message from all of them was, you have to work harder. That was the message. And this is a very common message, right? You know, there's discrimination out there. The solution is work even harder. And so I came after that. I was happy to have a chance to do that, but it was really sobering to see these really admirable women telling young lawyers that they should just work harder. So I do think that's, and I just a note to something Janna said, you know, Tom, it's the idea of time sovereignty, right? And the tension between the importance of time sovereignty for the worker and, you know, what are seen to be demands of the job. But so we have just little bits of saying that all jobs are going to have to be redefined, right? Because most jobs, aside from a whole set of bad, precarious jobs, most good jobs are full-time. And they're going to have to be disaggregated, right? They're going to have to be broken down into their components and made into either shared jobs or jobs for multiple people, that is, jobs shared among people. And we really hope that this will be the place for democracy in the workplace, right? That this big task of redefining everything, employers will see that they have to bring their workers in. The workers will have to be part of this project. It can't be a top-down thing if it's expected to work. So we see this as an invitation in to workplace democracy.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. I'm asking Lisa and Isabel maybe to come and share your reflections and your questions, because you've been commenting to each other, right? Lisa, you want to go first with your question?
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I live in the part-time paradise of the Netherlands, so maybe that is a question that is sort of coming from a question of privilege. But what I see here and in other European countries is that people are struggling to combine work and care, but there are so many tasks in society that don't fall under paid work, and they are not care work in a traditional sense either. They might have to do with neighborhood initiatives in a broader sense, or they might have to do with environmental tasks, or they might have to do with lobbying for institutional change. And I mean, it's this deja vu experience that everyone says, oh yeah, shouldn't we? But then no one has time because of work and family. And so I'm just wondering whether we don't need a kind of third category here, or maybe broaden the notion of care, but that would be in tension with some of the things that you said, Jenny, for a kind of civic work that is just urgently needed in society, and that is something third in a way, and that we need to make more time for. So yes. I'd be interested to hear what you think about these, both of you.
I agree completely. Maybe somebody here will remember the name of there's a woman, I think my generation really, but wrote about this much earlier, a German feminist who talked about the 4 spheres and
Frida Haug.
Yes, right. So Frida Haug, it does exactly that, right? And so community work is a piece of that. So it's roughly care. I can't remember, but anyway, that's an important.
I think it's self-work, paid work, community work, care, and political work is one of them.
Yeah. So political activism, and community work, I think, is tremendously important, and I do that was my real tension in filling out my my poll earlier. Would it be leisure or would it be community activism? Because I think both of those have suffered in my own life, trying to do family and work. And so we do talk about it as being very important, and we expect that everybody will use some of their extra time for that, right? But it is, Rainer Forst pointed out the arithmetic to me, that actually it's 52 hours we're talking about between paid work and unpaid care. That's a lot, right? Of kind of socially demanded contribution, right? If you call it that, and then you have to figure out the other stuff, is in the time left over. So I think that's true, but I do think that it would it would still allow for significant amount of time for community activism. But as you rightly say, we really don't want to call community activism care. In the sense, of course, it is motivated by care. I once had an unfortunate sentence that said, community activism is not care. And one of my young activist colleagues really freaked out about that. And so that sentence isn't in there. But I grew up, came of age in the 60s and 70s when all the radical organizations, anti-war stuff, they were all run by men, and the women got the coffee and ran the mimeograph machines. So, and we see today that NGOs, they are not models of good worker relations. So I'm just not, I don't want to say, well, if I'm out saving the whales by advocating for, better legislation in oceans, I don't have to cook or clean up after dinner. We've had centuries of that. So that's why I'm not prepared to blend those, but I think it remains an absolutely vital part of what living fully is.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. And maybe this relates back again to changing norms, right? So Joshua, maybe you want to reflect on that with your norm question.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I want to include Janna too, and as well as Jenny, but like I still want to push a little bit about mechanisms for changing norms. I think norms are super powerful, and there's lots of models in philosophy and economics that don't take enough account of norms. But mechanisms for changing norms, including for changing gender norms. So we were asked kind of to reflect on our personal situation. I should probably say that I was the one who said that he works less. They work less than their contract hours right now. My wife has taken a new job. We've moved. I'm on sabbatical, so I have flexible time, but I'm writing way less than I normally would because both our teenager and our 4-year-old have all sorts of transition issues, as well as my mom's parent. And that's happened throughout my life when both of my parents had cancer, being a primary advocate and caregiver for them, right? How do you incentivize? How does one incentivize? I just got a thing here. How does one incentivize that kind of male participation? Because I feel like when I do that, what actually happens is not that that's incentivized, but in fact that it's assumed that I won't be doing that, and that that's reflected on how, for example, maybe even my career might look to some people, for example, much less within the organization. So can you say just a little bit more about not just how norms are powerful, but transition steps, either, in the academy, in the workforce, public policy, that would incentivize that kind of care work?
Yeah. Yeah, that's of course a very important question, and but I like to think back to the big change in gender norms in the 70s, right? Which began at this grassroots level, and so I guess in the first instance, what we hope for from the book is not new laws, right? But more and more conversations. And I sort of sadly, I'm relying on the fact that I think a lot of people are very unhappy with the current arrangements. They don't like the tensions around work-family life. I see it in my young law students who, including the men, who are not looking forward to the hours at the big law firms that, is the prize you're supposed to be after. So I think there are shifts happening, and more I hear that, the younger generation, whether it's this quiet quitting, or even in the professions where it doesn't quite take that form, they're just not on board with our generation's model of ambition and success. And I noticed that I feel when my students or my sons I talked to one of my sons as a lawyer, and what would be the next step up in his job? I said, well, would you be interested? And he said, oh no, they just work way too hard. And I have this kind of double reaction. Oh, good, I raised a part-time for aller. But then I think, well, how come he's not more ambitious, right? But I think we all have these conversations, and we can reinforce and we can tell the positive stories. So what I think has happened in the 70s with the feminist transformations We just need millions of conversations about how our current system is just totally unacceptable. And we can see in cases like Korea, you know, where all the rich countries are headed in some direction, right? That it's not a sustainable model, and including sustainability in terms of the earth too. This is a model that is nobody's asked about this, but it has to work with a degrowth model, or whatever the best language is, you know, a market economy that is not growth based, right? That's what we've got to have, because this is about less production and less consumption, which, you know, used to be the definition of an economic crisis, right? That's what we're after. So, but I think I am counting on something as primitive as conversation, right? And lots of individual efforts, including efforts then within unions. So we haven't had a chance to talk about that. I just want to put this on the table. At a panel I did a couple of weeks ago, there was a labor lawyer from Poland, or labor activist, and she belongs to some small union, and they're all about advocating for fewer hours. Whereas in North America, though you did say there are North American labor people involved in this organization, in general, the labor unions in North America have not been at the forefront of progressive change, not on gender, not on race. And their agenda, I think, still roughly is full-time employment for all. That's their job, is, you know, to protect jobs and make sure everybody has full-time employment. And so, but it's very important to get them on board, right? To get the labor movements to see, yeah, this is a better way to work. So I don't have a program, you know, follow A, B, and C. We just should all talk.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. Janna, maybe some reflections, and then I would like to give the floor to Isabel for some of her questions, and then we're slowly going to round up because I'm going to give you your Friday back.
Sure, let me try and be really quick then. I think, Joshua, I was just writing in the chat a few minutes ago that actually when part-time work came about in the Netherlands, which was about in the 1980s, it was one of the points of the feminist movement, and also part of the feminist movement in the trade unions who advocated for part-time work, and their entire feminist treatise, essays showing or arguing that if women in the Netherlands, who at that point were still mainly quitting the labor force at the point that they got their first child, that if they would continue in work and would continue to work part-time, then we could expect their spouses to start doing more work at home. Right? And it was just kind of a given that from their improved position in the household, in the labor market, they would have more bargaining power to then arrange things more equitably at home, right? And that just never happened. And there is still research going on saying that argues that if women have a better bargaining position in the household, they would redistribute that more. I don't think there's been a lot of evidence that actually works. And so to me, that kind of change can't come from households and can't come from families in that sense. It has to be more structural. And I think one part of that is service provision, right? Is something as simple as countries with a lot of part-time work where schools actually finish at 3 p.m. or at 12 on some days, right? Assuming that somebody is going to be there to pick up the kids, compared to countries where childcare is just much more in sync with the workday, right? And so that syncing of workday and care, I think, is important. And I think the other part that is going to be really important is the workplace itself, and that is maybe where that democratization can come in as well. Is changing that culture of what is acceptable and what should be standard hours, which is that negotiation over working hours, I think in that sense really has to come back. And that can also perhaps come back in a discussion around the right to disconnect and the right to your time to actually say, current legislation coming in, also practices coming in that you cannot just email everyone in the weekend, on the evenings. And I think those kind of discussions need to be had in workplaces.
Can I just say One thing I saw one interesting statistic that, so we know that the women's participation in the paid labor force is going up worldwide. But if we were on the current trajectory across the globe of male participation in the household, it would be about 200 years before we reached parity.
Yeah,
so
exactly. Isabel, I see a lot of your reflections and questions based on earlier posed questions as well, also relating to how can we connect this to the discussion around the basic income. Jenny already pointed at living wage, right? Or job guarantees. Can you share some of your reflections from this discussion?
Yes, well, thank you, Fiona. Thank you, thank you, Janna, and thank you, Jenny. It's super, super interesting. So that's a really like a discussion that I certainly, but I guess everyone would think more about. It's not so easy to absorb. I wanted maybe to make 2 points and ask for more input from your end on 2 points. The first one is about the connection between part-time, arguing for part-time, and care. To me, it doesn't seem necessary. There are many, many good reasons why we would like to see a reduction in working time without having to argue about the whole unjust distribution of care, especially between men and women. And I'm wondering if it could be one way. I mean, that could be a fastest way, I would say, to raise the topic in policy debates, for instance, when you connect to two dimensions, the fact that the younger generations are clearly not willing to engage in so much overwork, so it's adjusting to workers' preferences, or to pay attention to our overall environmental imprint by reducing our amount of work. These are, I mean, important conversations already happening, and that is already, I think, are already strong arguments to care for a reduction and arguing for part-time, for so to adjust the norm of full working hours to a lower bar. And I very much, I totally like that idea, obviously. And my question here would be, can you be a bit more precise? I'm not sure I understood what you suggest, because you said it's not going to be compulsory. So basically, am I wrong to understand that what you suggest is to change the legislation by saying that, you know, in our country, like a full-time work is 30 hours per week, and let people work higher, but just by stating that norm, you expect this change in cultural norms to happen. So what would be the device there? So that's my first question. The second question is, it's not entirely clear to me what you call care, because you said that, for instance, you said that getting involved in some civic association, volunteering is not care, because this could be understood as care for the community. But at the same time, you talked about care for the planet, referring to, I guess, some voluntary work aimed at taking care of reproducing the habitability, the conditions for the habitability of the planet. So can you just help me a bit on that front, because to me it's still not clear, and I guess that's also from there that some misunderstanding are coming on my end. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Okay.
Isabel. Can Jenny and Janna, can I ask both of you to respond to Isabel's questions and make your closing remarks at the same time? Because then we're rounding up with that. Is that okay?
Yeah, Janna, you want to start?
Sure, yeah. Because I think also my reaction would be rather short, and I really agree with a lot of what you're saying, Isabel. And from my part, that really means that for me, I would put my hope in the more collective work time reduction. So I think what we've seen throughout so many years now is that individual reduction of work hours that we call flexibility or part-time or whatever has all become associated with stigmatization of against ideal worker norms. And so I really wouldn't put my hope in that. So I really would put my hope in the more collective reductions. But I would hope that we can find a way to do that also allows for personal preferences, for personal willingness either to do care or to do paid work. And I really, for the more philosophical view on work, on paid work and unpaid work, I think I really would prefer to then come to a solution where that work, that care in the household is no longer fully unpaid, but that we are able to do that in a way that also really chops away at the distinction between paid work that is not care-related work and unpaid work that is just a chore that we all need to do, whether that be for 5 hours a week or for 22 hours a week. But to start to really look at how we can put that together so that you maybe link that even to a basic income, something that also shows that we actually value that rather than saying it's so valuable that we should all do it for free.
Okay, thank you. So that's helpful. So first, on not a necessary connection between reduction in work hours and care. So that is literally true because we have, as I said at the outset, these separate strands, right? There are many researchers and many activists who are working on one and not looking at all to the other. But in fact, I think the interdependence is necessary. It's unavoidable. The structure of work shapes how we organize care, and work relies on care. So we are taught a fantasy that care is some matter of private preference and household organization. But of course, as I said, we should know from COVID, when the daycare is shut down, people can't get their work done. So I think I really want to resist that. I want to push hard to get people to see that the structures of work always shape the structures of care and vice versa. And so we can, of course, reduce work hours without, and keep the disaster on the care side in place, right? That's a possibility. But I don't see why one would want to do it. It would be much better for society if we integrate these things and integrate them in a way that reflects the actual reality that work shapes care and relies on care. And yeah, so that's the first big thing. I definitely think a basic income is a good path. Tom and I disagree about this a little bit. That's why there's not more about it in the book. He thinks it's better to put our strategic energies into better social services. That, that if they're really good social, if the state pays for healthcare and transportation and education, then what's needed for a living wage is much lower. And it'll be more reliable to get everybody up to a good level than basic income, which is going to come in at poverty level. So, but that's a strategic choice. And what we realized is different countries are going to decide different things. I like the idea of a basic income because it is the only thing that will actually transform the idea that everybody has to work. But I do just want to say one thing. If this goes to the personal preference point, which I strongly resist. I mean, of course, I'm for personal preference in some things, but, people say, well, some people just don't like care. Well, in our cultures, almost nobody says, I don't like work. I'm not really well set up for it. I don't like anybody telling me what to do. Now, I will say the exceptions are the libertarians who advocate basic income, but they're a little tiny sliver of any population. In general, everybody accepts that it is everyone's obligation who can to work. But care is a matter of personal preference. It just happens that poor people do it and that women do it. And, so we all know that can't be right. And so I think it's really a mistake to tacitly accept that everyone has an obligation to work, but care is a matter of personal preference. And since the structures of the two are absolutely, inevitably interdependent, I don't think you can mess around with personal preference on one side, but not on the other, because they'll impact one another. So I think norms, not laws, but strong norms that everybody does care. I think paid care, wages for housework, these arguments have been around for a long time. They will not revalue care. They'll just come in at low wages for care in the home as well as elsewhere. They will do nothing, and they'll do nothing to address the care policy divide. It'll still be men who can afford to, outsource their care obligations who are running things. And there may be some women who end up there too, but they are also not doing care because there's no time to do care if you're in those high-level jobs. So I think I'm really in favor of the structural interconnection between work and care, and resisting the idea that personal preference should be our model for care but not work, and only work in terms of how many hours you do. We know there are strong norms, and those norms should be restructured. And we do need incentives. I'll just say this one word because I didn't manage to get it in earlier. Of course, France, when they transitioned to the 35-hour work week, there were a lot of government incentives for companies who participated in this trade, wages for hours. So there are lots of ways in which the state can play a facilitative role here, even though they're not mandating a limit on 30.